Thank you for being with us here today on our webinar, Don't Hesitate, Communicate. I'm Linda Remsburg, an associate with Grow and Lead, and I'll tell you a little bit about our organization. We work throughout the UP. Our vision is for an Upper Peninsula where all youth can thrive. And the way that we work toward that is strengthening the nonprofit sector. So we help build capacity of nonprofits of all shapes and sizes. We provide training and resources, education for nonprofits so they can do their jobs and do them very well. And we promote an asset-based kind of framework of youth development, building on the strengths of youth. And so that's a little bit about us, and I am going to turn things over to my colleague, Chad Mager, an associate here at Grow and Lead, and so he's going to take you through the next hour. Chad, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Linda, and good morning, everybody. Sorry if we had a little technical difficulties earlier, if anyone was on right away. I don't know what happened there, but it'll be good. So hopefully you're here to learn some communication techniques. A lot of what I'm going to talk about today is framed from someone in a supervisory or leadership position to a subordinate. However, if you look at the principles that will be discussed, these really work with any kind of relationship. But of course, trying to strengthen organizations, we're going to take it from the standpoint of making sure that when you're trying to guide people, whether it's volunteers or staff people, someone that works for you, or that they're getting the right information they need to be successful. So we're going to start off with the very first part of the webinar title, which was "Don't Hesitate," and that was specifically, it wasn't just for a cute little rhyme. There's an actual purpose behind it. So why do we hesitate to give effective, clear communication? Often we just kind of make this assumption that people just should understand. You tell them once something and they should get it. But what we don't realize is a lot of our communication and a lot of the communication issues we have comes from us. Not the person receiving the information, but those of us who are giving the information. So we're really hesitant sometimes to communicate for a couple different reasons. One is we assume too much. We assume that the person should just know. So they should know by now. They've been here for so long. They've done this before, or someone else should have taught them. So a lot of times when we're trying to communicate or give a message or give instructions, we assume far too much. I don't have to share with you the old adage of what assuming does. I don't think I'll leave that there. If you don't know, Google it. But so we can't assume that people just know. We can't stop and fail to communicate because, well, they should know, or I think they already know. Those are not excusable answers. Second, we told them one time before. So we think in our mind, especially if we're in a hurry, we're busy, that I already told them this before. In reality, sometimes telling someone once is simply not enough. Your expectation may be that it is, but I don't think that's really a realistic expectation. Sometimes telling once is not enough. And the other thing is, that we'll talk about later on, sometimes just telling them is not enough, because sometimes people need to be shown, not just told. Another reason why we hesitate to communicate is that there's no real accountability. So there's no reason for us to make sure, or again, if we're a supervisor looking to communicate, there's no pressure from anyone else to push us to be better communicators. So sometimes that helps if that's one of your goals. with someone who you report to say, hey, can we talk about my communication? Can we get feedback from some people who work for me to make sure that I'm communicating in an effective way? Another thing that causes confusion when communicating is vague instructions. So if you're giving instructions and you're assuming that people are hearing them or getting them and understanding them, sometimes we have to look at if we're being too vague. So those are just some things that we kind of make assumptions about when we're trying to communicate. But personally, why do we hesitate? There's a lot of personal reasons why we don't want to have these conversations with people who either are volunteering for us, people who work for us. If you're an executive position or the leader of an organization, hesitating to communicate clearly with your board that you work for. So some of those reasons are, and here's a big one. The first one is fear. It's the number one reason why we don't communicate on a regular basis effectively and clearly. Unfortunately, our people have a lot of fears. Fear that if we share too much, will it come back to bite us? Fear of what people will say. Fear. Sometimes we have a fear of even just talking in a semi-public forum. So you have to stand up in front of a group of say staff members or in front of your board, and you may have a fear of just that public speaking type of thing. So fear holds us back from a lot of stuff in our lives, and being able to communicate is one of them. In personal relationships, fear is often one thing that holds back, whether it's couples or even between parents and kids, or other family members. Fears of not knowing how someone will react, or fear of what the message will be, how it will be received, is one thing that really makes our communication suffer. Another thing of why we hesitate is we're too busy. So especially you supervisors out there, people who manage people, that is one of our biggest excuses. Oh, I don't have time to stop and tell this person every little thing. However, you'll find out that if you don't take the time, if you always claim you're too busy, the effectiveness and success of the people you're supposed to be instructing and guiding will greatly suffer. The third point I want to make about our hesitation is avoiding confrontations. A lot of us hate confrontations. So if we're holding someone accountable, or we're giving instructions, or we're giving correction because someone has continued to do something incorrectly after you've gone through all the good steps of communication and modeling and all that stuff, we hate that confrontation. I can't think of too many people who enjoy confrontation. So rather than not say anything, rather than to confront. And this goes again, not just in business, but in our personal lives, where you're afraid to confront somebody because of the ramifications of that. So I already mentioned that we assume too much. We assume that they should know already. So we don't want to keep, because sometimes we don't want to keep communicating or talking to somebody because we're worried they'll feel like we're nagging them. And that they should already know this stuff. They should already be prepared. They should already understand. So sometimes we also, there's another point, that we set too high of expectations. In other words, we're assuming that they have the skills, talents, and knowledge to get something done. So we set this high expectation for someone who's working for us or volunteering for us, and we haven't really gauged their abilities and experience well enough. So that our expectations are too high, and then we're disappointed. It's not that they really failed, it's that we're disappointed because they didn't meet the expectation we had already developed in our mind about what they can do. Sometimes we hesitate to communicate because we lack confidence. That's the tough one, and that's the great news about that one is it's something you can build and work on, is your confidence level. But sometimes people are afraid to communicate because, again, there's potential feedback they don't want to hear. There's potential pushback, resisting the information or the directive. So sometimes people just lack confidence to be able to step up and communicate when it's most important to do so. And lastly, that when communicating is that you just don't know how. A lot of people just don't know how to effectively communicate. It's one of those interesting things. We're taught to read, write, but there's not a ton of instruction in our lives about communication. It's one of the things we pick up a lot just in passing in our social interactions and even in our work lives. But being able to effectively communicate is not something that a lot of people have formal training. Unless you're a communications major, then you're listening to me and going, yeah, I get all this. But that's not everybody out there. So there's this mix of external and internal reasons that cause us to hesitate to communicate effectively, consistently, and clearly. And if any of these kind of hesitations resonate with you, your issues may be less with your communication with your staff, but has more to do with your internal struggles. In other words, you work on you work on some of your own things holding you back, and that might already open up far better communication to others. So in other words, a lot of our internal stuff hold us back from being effective communicators. But there's help available and ways you can work to overcome some of those internal things and some of those external things. Hopefully some of the tips I share with you today will help you overcome some of those things. But even for the ones we don't necessarily touch on a lot, we can always follow up with you. I'm more than happy to help you get over those hurdles. Because this is vital. If you want to have successful organizations, you want to have connected volunteers, you need to be able to communicate. So we're going to move on here. So before we jump to blaming our employees about not knowing how to do their jobs or failing to do what you tell them to do, we need to first take a look at ourselves and see if we're truly communicating as effectively as we think we are. Yes, as we think we are. So we need to stop and consider, is this less about them simply not doing what you've asked them to do? And possibly, just possibly, is it more about them being unsure of what you're asking them to do? If they don't seem to understand what they're supposed to be doing, is it because they don't pay attention? Or could it be that they were not trained to the level of competence to do their job independently? So again, before we make assumptions that it's all their fault, we need to take a step back and make sure, have we provided the necessary information and tools necessary? And there might be some people out there right now who are supervisors or managers, and they're not too pleased with me because they feel it's the employee's job to figure this stuff out. But honestly, that's simply not true. One of the most important jobs in managing and leading people is making sure your employees know what needs to be done. You need to make sure they understand how they fit into the big picture, and they have the knowledge and training necessary to successfully do their job, not merely just get by, but to successfully do their job. Because if you don't get them trained and full of knowledge to that level, you're always going to be frustrated with their performance, because they're just going to be able to do what you taught them to do or what they might pick up. So it's your role to make sure to ensure that that happens, that they are ready to do their job. If you think you can just continue to throw people into the fire to learn as they go, then you'll continue to have those frustrations that you might be experiencing now. That I know I have teenage kids, and they're starting off their first jobs, and some of them are in food service, and it's like, yeah, just throw on an apron and go at it. Just get in there. And my kid will come home like, I had no idea what I was doing today. It's like, yeah, that's not effective communication or training or anything to get someone ready for their job. So a boss comes back a couple weeks later and say, well, why don't you know how to do this? And my sense, because you never showed me how. No one taught me how to do this. So the failure wasn't that my son didn't know how to do his job necessarily. It was no one ever showed him or communicated what the expectations were, things he should have been doing, didn't know there was actually a checklist. No one showed him these kind of things. So again, it could be easy for a manager to be frustrated with an employee who's not doing the certain things, but the question you need to ask yourself as a supervisor or a manager is, have I given them all the information? Have I given them the tools? And just don't assume that you have. Do not assume that you have. We think often that we got this, we covered that, whatever. We'll talk a little bit more about how it's important to double check to make sure that the message is actually getting across like you think it is. So your options here for really changing, here they are. Either you change and try to become a better communicator, and better at equipping your employees or people. And this also goes, I'm saying employees, but this also goes to your volunteers. In fact, I think now is a good time to talk about volunteers. Since many of you work for nonprofits and you rely on volunteers to get jobs done, do you know the number one reason why a volunteer stops volunteering for an organization? Number one reason. Why? Because they stop believing in your mission? Nope. Because they got in a fight with somebody at an event? Nope. Because you failed to recognize them? Nope. The biggest reason why people stop volunteering for an organization is because they showed up sometime and they didn't feel like they contributed at all. That is the number one reason when polled by volunteers. In other words, they have to feel like they're doing something meaningful to help with what the situation or event they were called to help with. If they stand around not knowing what to do, they feel useless. They feel like they're not being productive and you've just wasted their time. If they're volunteering, they're giving of their free time, they're giving of their abilities. So they want to make it worthwhile. This is where communication becomes so vital when it comes to volunteers. You have to have a plan. If your plan right now with the organization is just like, well, we'll just put them to work whenever they get here. No, have a plan, communicate, and we'll go through some of these steps on what good communication looks like. But you have to have a plan for your volunteers if you want to keep them into the future going forward, to ask them back. Otherwise, you'll get a lot of those, no thank you, or I'm busy. If you have a trend of hearing that from volunteers who volunteered once, maybe a little heart-to-heart exit interview or follow-up would be good to find out exactly why they no longer want to volunteer. And it might be because they didn't have enough to do, or they didn't know what to do, or they weren't trained what to do. So that you put them in a situation where now they're overwhelmed. They don't have the answers that people are asking for of them, and they get frustrated and they get embarrassed. So if you're going to use volunteers, you want to have a clear communication plan, a clear set of instructions. Communication is not just verbal, it's also the written. So those kind of developing those instructions, developing those little job descriptions for your events for volunteers, or maybe you have volunteers involved in your day-to-day activities, your organization. Have something they can read, have something they can refer back to, so that when they feel like they're getting off track or they need answers, they know where to go to get them, rather than being left hanging out there, feeling like they're alone or they're not being productive or useful. No one wants to waste time. Even when they're giving up freely of theirs, no one wants to waste their time. So again, your options, leaders here, are either you work on yourself, become better at communication and equipping people, or, and this will freak out a lot of nonprofits, you go out and pay a lot more to find a much higher skilled employee that needs less instruction. One of those people who have been there, done it all, seen it all, and don't need you to tell them what to do. They'll just figure it out and go for it. But those people come at a price. You sure can find those kind of employees, but they'll cost you. And I'm guessing not many here are open to that approach. So you can create that kind of employee by being a better supervisor, by being a better communicator, and equipping them so that they grow in their job. And then you'll have already hopefully invested in your organization one of those rock stars when it comes to employees. So, all right, enough about that. Let's get off this graphic of the two talking on ancient telephones. So the very first part of communication, I'm going to use a bunch of C letters. So if you like those things that kind of flow together with all the similar, I got a bunch of C's for you. So the first one is clarity. You need to train people well. You need to be clear expectations, define duties, clear instructions. These are vital for people to understand what you're asking them to do. When you have vague instructions, when your verbal instructions are really broad and vague, that doesn't help someone do the job you're asking them to do. And it leaves a lot of room for interpretation. It leaves a lot of room for them to go off course. So if you want a specific thing done, be specific, be clear. So speak on important things directly. Don't waste time with long drawn out explanations or stories that may cause the person listening to you to let their mind wander. Get to the point, give them what they need to get, and then let them get going. Make sure you ask. Here's the key one. This is going back to what I mentioned. This works for volunteers and people you're supervising. Make sure you ask whether they understand. In other words, at the end, it could be a group, it could be one-on-one. Say, so do you understand what the task I just gave you? Do you understand what we just talked about and how we're moving forward and how we're going to tackle this project or whatever it is? All right, ask. So many times, people in the leadership role expect the employee to ask if they don't understand. Okay, let's just say that's how you feel. Well, they should ask me if they don't understand. Good for you. Let me pat you on the back and say you're going to experience more failure than someone else who takes this advice and actually asks if they understand. Why? Because you're not relying on them to be able to make that decision. You are double checking. You're being proactive, not reactive. So be proactive. Ask them if they understand. Give them the opportunity, give them the floor to be able to say, really, I don't. Could you talk about that point number 2 one more time? Much better than just sit there and go, well, they should ask me. That attitude's not going to get you anywhere. It's going to lead you to frustration. So be willing to be ready, be willing and ready to further explain any of your points that need to be clarified further. Don't expect someone just to know what you're saying. Even if in your mind it's crystal clear. I don't know how many times this has happened in the work environment here where I write something out, say it's for a blog or even in a contract, and go to one of my coworkers and say, does this make sense? And they go, what the heck are you saying? Because in my mind, I'm reading into it exactly what I think it is. However, it's good to get feedback from someone else to realize, is that what it's actually saying? Clear in my head, I've reread it probably a half dozen times, said, yep, that makes sense. But someone else reading it, it didn't make sense. So don't expect someone just to understand, automatically understand, and just to know. Make sure you're clear. Make sure you're as clear as possible. All right, consistency is pretty important. You need to have feedback, and if you're a manager and you keep changing their duties and responsibilities for their defined duties, if you keep on changing the game, then don't expect there to be no mistakes, or don't expect perfection and things that are not forgotten if there's a pattern of continuous change in your organization. In other words, the more change you have with someone's duties, then expect there are going to be some trip ups. There's going to be stuff that doesn't go quite right. But if things are consistent with what you're expecting them to do, that someone can get a rhythm, they can do it. Now, I guarantee you some of these nonprofits leaders are going, our things change all the time. Yes, it is. Yes, they do. So again, your importance of clarity, every time there's something new to do is important. The consistency part becomes once a set of instructions is given, you're consistent with that. Yes, events change, situations change all the time. But every time then you should be giving more instruction, communicating further details so they understand what the change means and what it's going to look like to their work. So make sure you're communicating frequently enough if there's change happening, and that the new instruction is consistent so your employees will have the confidence that they'll be adequately equipped by the time they need to be. So if a change is coming, a new type of event's coming, make sure you are prepared in advance to give them the information and to be able to communicate consistently on what they need to do and be prepared for the moment when they need to be. Make yourself available on a consistent basis, again, for staff if they need to come back to you for clarification and questions. And again, please don't ever look at their questions or need for clarifications as a sign that they're not paying attention or that they're not listening. That's not it. Some people just don't get it the first time around. Some people need to understand more or more well-rounded the situation or task at hand. So welcome questions, welcome the chance to clarify. But again, communicate consistently. Again, if you have regular scheduled staff meetings, great consistency, because that's a chance where everyone should have an opportunity to ask questions, to get answers, and it's a consistent thing they can look forward to. If you have chances to have one-on-one meetings with staff people or one-on-ones with your volunteers, again, to keep those on some kind of a rotation or consistent schedule can really help with your communication and getting the message across continually, because that's important. It's not just a one-time thing, it's a continual process. So be consistent with your message. Concise is what I just wasn't. Hopefully there's some courtesy laughs. Concise is getting to the point. And so I'm trying to do a lot of explanation and examples, so this is not really an example of being concise. But again, the more you give someone at one time, the more details, the more levels, the more set of instructions, the easier it is to get off track. The easier it is to get your message lost in all the other details. So be as concise. So even in written instructions, you've probably seen the use of, well, what I'm doing right now too, bullet points. Bullet points with a little bit of explanation underneath each one is a great way to simplify and be concise in your communication, but still getting the very most important details across. Staff meetings, talk about, you want to be concise. Please don't have staff meetings over an hour long. You've lost your staff at that point. Know exactly what needs to be covered, how you're going to get there, communicate it, and get out. But be concise. You don't have to keep long-winded. People just get bored. Their minds wander, and then you just you lose them. So stay concise, to the point. Narrow it down to the most important pieces of information, and then if someone needs clarity, they can always ask and follow up with you exactly if they need more. But for the majority of the people, they'll probably just need a concise explanation, and they can ready to move on, especially those who've been with you a while or have volunteered a lot in the past or worked for you for years. So, all right, our next C word is connect. All right, so connecting is where the part where you're making sure there's the comprehension part of your instructions, of your communication. So you want to make sure that when you're giving, when you're connecting with your staff or volunteers or whoever you're communicating with, you want to make sure that that connection is made, because that's where the transfer of communication. So that connection is made, like, one of the great ways is the way you use your body language. So if your face is showing that you're not happy, that you're upset, and you're trying to communicate new instructions or daily tasks or whatever, your receivers, that means your staff or volunteers or whoever you're talking to, are seeing something that may be different than what you're intending. So we have to be very careful what our face shows. Our bodies, our posture says a lot more than just our words do. So make sure that those two are in alignment when you're trying to pass on important information, because the last thing you want to do is confuse your audience, whoever's listening to you, by sending mixed messages between what you're saying out of your mouth and what your body's showing. And that way, that comfortability, where your body's comfortable, you're at a good spot, good place, it shows on your face, is a far better connection with somebody when you're trying to communicate. So when you're able to give instructions or communicate directly with someone and make eye contact, so that's, again, a really good way of connection, not just simply barking out orders, which, by the way, giving orders is a way to communicate. It is not a hugely effective way to communicate. So again, look for this chance to connect so someone really gets it. And then here's a chance to practice those active listening skills. Really listen. Now you're saying, wait a second, Chad, I am the one communicating this stuff. Yes, you are. Yes, you are. But again, the feedback from the employee or from the volunteer, how you listen to them, their questions, their concerns, their fears, is going to bring so much more to the relationship, and help that ability to connect with one another. A well listened to volunteer feels more valued than someone who's just facing the crowd. So when you respond, when you listen, and then it's your turn to respond to whatever Their feedback is, this shows how important they are to you, and that their success and what you've asked them to do, their success and their tasks are very important to you. You're not just throwing out stuff and going, just go do it, yeah, go do it. But you're taking the time to make sure someone feels equipped, feels valued. Now, granted, I know some of you are going, oh, I have 30 volunteers. It could take you 30 seconds to walk up to each one and say, hey, do you know what you feel like you know what you're doing? Is there anything I can help you with? Or, and again, if you have other staff members, you don't have to be the only one doing this. Delegate to have some paid staff that walk around to volunteers to make sure they understand what their role is and how important their part plays in whatever you're doing. Again, a great way to connect when you're communicating. So make sure you use eye contact, use the body language, tone of voice is another great way to connect, because it can go the opposite way if your voice is not, the tone is not conveying something that you're encouraging, but your frustration. In other words, yeah, your frustration and anger come through in your tone very quickly, very easily. But again, look to listen to people where they feel heard. They're much more receptive then to the guidance and communication you're trying to give them. So let them feel heard. All right, so comprehend. So you want to keep communicating with anyone you're trying to get the message across to the point of comprehension. Yes, so it may take more than once. You want to keep the message going forward, whatever it is, whether it's written, email, verbally, whatever. You want to keep communicating to those who need to hear it to the point that they actually comprehend. So if your employee or your volunteer continually doesn't seem to grasp what you're telling them, it's one of those times where you're going, okay, wait a second, I've said this now multiple times, multiple different formats and ways to do this. What is it, something about my style or method of communication? Am I not doing something correct over here? Or is this, see if there's something that needs to be worked on. Maybe it's that confusion in your mannerisms versus what you're trying to communicate. The other one you have to realize is if they continually don't understand, maybe it's not you, the communicator, and maybe they are not up to the task that you're giving them. And that's okay to, hopefully, not everyone understands that, and hurt feelings are possible, but it's better also to communicate about that and be honest and clear and just be able to share, like, I don't think this job right here is the perfect one for you, this role. How about we have you go over here and do this? If someone continually cannot seem, no matter what methods you try, no matter what styles you try to communicate, and they still continually can't get it. But again, your job as the communicator, as the one who's leading, the one who's organizing, to keep communicating to the very point where you've pretty much exhausted everything so they can comprehend what you need to have them do. So one way to find out if it's about your style or if it's about the person receiving is communicating the same instructions to someone else. And that's what we love to do here at Grow and Lead, is work with our coworkers and say, hey, I'm trying to communicate this, whether it's verbally or written, like I just mentioned, the written part, verbally, and say, does this help, or is this message getting through, or what are you hearing versus what I'm hearing? Because sometimes our instructions might be too vague. They might be too difficult, might be too long, and we don't realize it, because in our head, we already understand the process. We know what needs to be done, but it's actually translating that, so to speak, so that the employee can actually understand, or the volunteer can actually understand that. You might be a semi-expert, you might be very experienced in this, but they're not. So maybe there's a different way to say the same thing. Maybe the way you're saying it has a lot of jargon or very specific language for the type of work you do, and they're just not up to speed with the acronyms. There's still, to this day, I've been at Grow and Lead 5 years, there are still acronyms thrown around the office. Sometimes I go, oh boy, what is that again? Because I'm not quite sure, especially when it comes to organizations and stuff like that. So make sure the message you're sending, that you're doing it to the point where they can comprehend. And again, it takes work. If I gave any hints that this is not a lot of work on your part as a supervisor, I should have warned you ahead of time. But it does, if we really want to get across the message to the people we're sending them to, we need to take time, make sure it happens. in a way that they can understand. The next C is control. Well, I kind of cheated here. It's really our self-control. Is very important in good communication. So nothing will really thwart your efforts more than you losing your temper or talking down to your employee, or even worse sometimes, no, equally as bad, a volunteer. You want to lose a volunteer quick? Yeah, just talk down to them or demean them at one point where your frustration comes through. They won't be back. An employee might be because they have to, because they need the paycheck, but you would have damaged a solid work relationship. So yes, if there's an issue that needs to be addressed and you can feel your temperature rising, you need to take time to have yourself under control before you attempt any sort of confrontation or correction, or frankly, any sort of communication. You need to take that time. If you're out of control, it's likely you might say something wrong, say the wrong things or the wrong way, and actually make things even worse. So in an attempt to make things better, you make them worse. You really do have to give respect if you expect to receive it from an employee or a volunteer. The days of old, if I have to say this is an environment. My father's actually also in corporate training, and we talk about this a lot. The days that he grew up where the boss just demanded respect, those days are long gone. If you expect to have a place, an organization where you can just demand respect from everybody and expect them just to go, yes sir, yes ma'am, whatever you say, that's not going to happen anymore. That's old school. People now need to know that there's a mutual respect, not just a one-way street. So if you're relying on I am the boss type of mentality, then you'll get workers that just do exactly what they're told and nothing more. They'll never go the extra mile for you, and they won't respect you even if they obey you. And again, I maybe there's some leaders out there who are okay with that. I surely wouldn't. I'd really rather have someone who's on the team and involved and very concerned about the work they're doing, whether they're a volunteer or a paid person, and not just obedient because they need a paycheck. So therefore, whenever you're communicating, no matter what kind, and especially if it's confrontation or correction, but anytime you're entering into communication with those who are looking for instruction from you, make sure you have a clear head and that you are in control of yourself before you launch into that. This is probably one of those areas that things really blow up the worst, is when a boss just goes off and everyone feels extremely defeated and accused and not valued. So again, if you're a leader and you have a short temper, or you tend to get a little miffed real quickly, make sure you build into yourself and learn some techniques to how to step back, step out, get yourself under control before you engage people again, because you don't want to do more damage, especially if you've been working on these other things of communication. You would hate for one situation to really erode a good working relationship or damage it. So another C is confidence, your confidence. So yes, you are the supervisor, or you are in charge of a certain group of people at your organization, but don't go to the extreme and believe that you're the supreme overlord. But at the same time, you don't apologize for the fact that you have a job to do. So communicate with confidence. As long as you're not being arrogant, that confidence will actually instill confidence in the people you're talking to, whether you're employees or volunteers. Reassure them that you know what you're doing, but also you know what they're doing. In other words, you have to make sure they feel, again, that value, that's, yeah, don't believe me, I hear you, we got this, here's what I need you to do. Make sure it shows confidence that you know where the organization is headed, and that those employees or volunteers can trust and follow you. That's the confidence you need to have, especially if you're leading an organization. But even those who are, maybe you're an employee and you're in charge of a bunch of volunteers for an event, have confidence. People feed off of confidence. And for those of you who just naturally are not confident, fake it till you make it. Fake it till you make it. In other words, if you have to put on this kind of you're not really totally feeling confident inside, but you kind of put on that exterior like, we can do this, come on everybody, that people will feed off of that, even if it's not totally sincere or you're worried. Because actually, even pretending to be confident to yourself will build your own confidence. The more things stack up and start going well, it's like, yeah, I can do this. Yes, we are doing well. So even if you have to convince yourself, try to put on that air of confidence. Don't be too shy to use your position, your power to communicate, to get everyone moving in the direction you know your organization or group needs to go to. All right. If you're put in position of leadership, then it is your job to make sure that people are listening. And again, you want them to be listening partly because they want to, but sometimes you have to say, no, come on, everyone listen now. This is what we need to get done. And here's where the rubber meets the road. So again, be confident. You're being paid to do a job, or you're a part of an organization and given a task to be that leader, to lead this to successful outcome. So have confidence in yourself. Believe in yourself, and your people will believe in you too. So there we go. So that kind of wraps up my points on communication today. I took about only 45 minutes, so hopefully that you don't mind and wrapping up a little early. But Grow and Lead, if any of this stuff you listened to and said, yeah, Chad, that's great, but I don't know how to do that stuff, or I don't know how to get from where I'm at to doing those kind of communication styles, or how to be consistent or concise, or whatever it is that might be holding you back, we can offer coaching here at Grow and Lead. I've actually been coaching a few people on both their leadership styles and their communication styles. We also offer organizational-wide communication audits, leadership and managerial training, sometimes employee trainings. If you really have something that needs more thorough instruction that maybe you don't feel confident giving a full training on, and you want an outside group to come in, we can do focus groups to find out how exactly things are going in your organization. And we also do a lot of teamwork training. And again, teamwork training is interesting because the bulk of teamwork training is learning how to effectively communicate with each other by far. So thank you so much for joining us this morning. Here's my contact information, my email address, and also our web address if you want to check us out, learn more about our organization, or if you want to message me directly to talk more about the issue of communication and or if you need any assistance with you and your organization. So thank you again from Linda, who helped introduce me and who's been doing the background stuff of this. Thank you for your help, Linda, and thank you everyone for joining us this morning, and hope to see you at the next webinar. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Chad.